The morning sun filtered through grimy windows of the Frontier Grill, a roadside diner where the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the bacon grease had been accumulating personality since the Reagan administration. At a corner table sat Thomas Bear McKenna, 71 years old, his weathered hands steady as granite as he cut his eggs into precise squares. The wheelchair he occupied was government issue, functional, not fashionable, but the man in it carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd never learned to surrender. Before continuing this story, please comment below with your city or country where you're watching from. Your feedback inspires us to do better. Earlier that morning, Bear had quietly paid for breakfast for a young mother and her two children who were counting change at the register, their travel-worn clothes and nervous glances telling a story he recognized from his own childhood. "On me," he'd told the cashier with a voice that brooked no argument, slipping her 220s with the practiced discretion of a man who'd learned that dignity was sometimes more valuable than cash. The woman had tears in her eyes when she thanked him, and Bear had simply nodded, understanding that sometimes the best kindness was the kind that didn't require a speech. But kindness, as Bear had learned in 71 hard years, was often mistaken for weakness by people who'd never been tested by life's sharper edges. The diner's door exploded open with enough force to rattle the coffee cups, admitting 6 men who entered like a plague of locusts in leather jackets. The Iron Wolves, a motorcycle club that confused volume with authority and mistook intimidation for respect. Their leader, a hulking specimen named Diesel Morrison who'd earned his nickname through excessive consumption of truck stop stimulants rather than mechanical expertise, surveyed the room like a conquering general. "Morning, folks," Diesel announced with the kind of fake friendliness that masked genuine malice. "Hope everyone's ready for some excitement." The diner's other patrons, a farmer reading crop reports, 2 truck drivers arguing about routes, an elderly couple sharing a waffle, all found sudden fascination with their plates. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Helen who'd been serving coffee and wisdom in equal measure for 30 years, tightened her grip on the coffee pot like it might become a weapon. But Bear McKenna kept eating his eggs, cutting them with the same methodical precision he'd maintained through 3 wars and 47 years of military service. He'd seen worse than 6 drunk bikers before his morning coffee. Hell, he'd been worse than 6 drunk bikers before his first cup of coffee. "Hey, Wheels," Diesel called out, his voice carrying the particular nastiness of someone who'd peaked in high school and spent the subsequent decades in decline. "You got a staring problem, old man?" Bear looked up from his breakfast, his pale blue eyes meeting Diesel's bloodshot gaze with the kind of calm that came from having nothing left to prove. He'd stared down enemy snipers, interrogated captured terrorists, and negotiated with warlords who made these weekend warriors look like choir boys. "Just eating my breakfast," Bear replied, his voice carrying the flat neutrality of someone who'd learned that the most dangerous words were often the quietest ones. Diesel swaggered across the diner, his boots making enough noise for a marching band, followed by his pack of followers who mistook proximity to violence for courage. They surrounded Bear's table like buzzards around roadkill, their leather jackets creaking with manufactured menace. "You know what I think?" Diesel continued, leaning down until his beer breath washed over Bear like a toxic fog. "I think you've been living too easy, getting handouts from Uncle Sam while real Americans work for a living." The irony wasn't lost on Bear, being lectured about work by someone whose primary occupation involved intimidating civilians and whose most demanding physical activity was kickstarting a motorcycle. But he'd learned long ago that explaining irony to idiots was like teaching philosophy to goldfish. Possible in theory, futile in practice. "Eat your breakfast, friend," Bear said quietly, never taking his eyes off Diesel's face. Everybody's got to eat. But Diesel Morrison hadn't built his reputation, such as it was, on reasonable discourse and mutual respect. He'd built it on being bigger, louder, and more aggressive than the people around him, a strategy that worked surprisingly well in a world where most folks just wanted to get through their day without drama. "Don't you friend me, cripple," Diesel snarled, his hand shooting out to grab the front of Bear's flannel shirt. The fabric was old but well-maintained, the kind of shirt that had seen honest work and honest wear. The grab was meant to intimidate, to establish dominance, to show everyone in the diner who was in charge. Instead, it accomplished something Diesel hadn't anticipated. RIIIIP. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the diner's tense silence like a knife through silk. The shirt's front panel separated, revealing Bear McKenna's chest, and with it, a story written in black ink that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Centered over Bear's heart was a tattoo that belonged in a museum of military history. A black dagger, its blade pointing downward, surrounded by a trident and eagle that marked its owner as one of the most elite warriors America had ever produced. Below the dagger, etched in numbers so clean they might have been carved yesterday, was the figure 347. The Iron Wolves burst into laughter, the kind of forced, manic laughter that people use to fill spaces where silence becomes uncomfortable. "Holy shit!" wheezed one of Diesel's lieutenants, a scrawny tweaker named Spider, who'd earned his nickname through his resemblance to an insect that had been stepped on but kept moving. "Look at Grandpa's prison tats." "Nice artwork, old man," Diesel jeered, though something in his voice had shifted, a note of uncertainty that he tried to mask with increased aggression. "What's that number supposed to be? Your social security?" Bear McKenna looked up at the 6 men surrounding his table, his expression unchanged, his voice carrying the same flat calm it had maintained throughout the encounter. "That number," he said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water, "is my confirmed kill count." The laughter stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Bear continued, his eyes never leaving Diesel's face, his voice never rising above conversational level. "That dagger is the mark of Naval Special Warfare Group 1, SEAL Team 6. And every one of those 347 marks represents someone who made the mistake of thinking they were tougher than they actually were." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Even the coffee pot had stopped percolating, as if the machine itself was holding its breath. In the corner booth, a man who'd been quietly working on his laptop looked up from his screen. Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Reaper Collins had been tracking a fugitive through 3 states when he'd stopped for coffee and found himself witnessing something extraordinary. More importantly, he'd recognized the tattoo on Bear's chest, not from pictures or stories, but from classified briefings about America's most decorated special operations personnel. Bear McKenna wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend. Collins reached for his secure satellite phone, a piece of equipment that existed outside normal communication networks and connected directly to people who didn't officially exist. His fingers moved quickly across the keypad, sending a message that would change the trajectory of everyone's day. Priority. Alert, SEAL Team. 6 Original. Call sign Bear. Location. Frontier Grill. Highway 287. Civilians threatening. Immediate response required. The response came back in less than 30 seconds. En route. ETA 15 minutes. Maintain Overwatch. Back at Bear's table, Diesel Morrison was struggling with a reality that didn't match his preconceptions. The old man in the wheelchair, the disabled veteran he'd planned to humiliate for the amusement of his followers, was claiming to be one of America's most lethal warriors. "You're full of shit," Diesel said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Old man in a wheelchair talking about killing people. You probably got that tattoo in prison." Bear McKenna smiled for the first time since the bikers had entered the diner. It wasn't a pleasant expression, more like what a shark might manage if it had learned to appreciate irony. "Son," Bear said, his voice carrying a note of almost paternal disappointment, "I've killed enemy combatants in 17 different countries, using everything from sniper rifles to bare hands to improvised explosives made from fertilizer and diesel. Fuel. I've eliminated terrorist cells, destroyed enemy infrastructure, and extracted American hostages from places so classified that admitting they exist would start international incidents." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee as if discussing the weather. "The wheelchair isn't from age or accident. It's from an IED in Afghanistan when I was covering the extraction of a captured CIA operative. The blast took my legs, but I kept shooting until the birds were in the air. Got a Navy Cross for that one, though most of the details are still classified." The diner had become so quiet that the sound of Bear's coffee cup touching the saucer seemed as loud as a gunshot. "Now," Bear continued, "you boys can apologize for your behavior and leave quietly. Or we can continue this conversation until people arrive who are a lot less patient than I am. Diesel Morrison was many things. Loud, aggressive, chemically enhanced, and not particularly bright, but he wasn't entirely stupid. Something in the old man's voice, in those pale blue eyes, in the absolute confidence with which he spoke about killing people, had penetrated even Diesel's beer and amphetamine-addled consciousness. But pride is a powerful drug, especially when mixed with alcohol and an audience of equally stupid followers. "You think you're scary because you've got some ink?" Diesel snarled, though he took a half-step back from Bear's wheelchair. "You're a crippled old man talking tough. What are you gonna do? Run me over?" Bear McKenna's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by several degrees. "I don't need to do anything," Bear said quietly. "I just need to wait." As if summoned by his words, the rumble of engines began filtering through the diner's windows. Not the distinctive thunder of motorcycle engines, but something deeper, more powerful, the sound of precision machinery operated by professionals. Diesel turned toward the windows, his swagger faltering as three black SUVs pulled into the diner's parking lot with military precision. The vehicles were unmarked but unmistakably government issue, the kind of transport that didn't appear in civilian areas unless something very serious was happening. The SUV doors opened in perfect synchronization, disgorging 8 men in tactical gear that cost more than most people's cars. They moved with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together for years, their weapons visible but not threatening. Yet, the lead figure was a man in his 40s, built like a professional boxer, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His uniform bore no identifying patches, but the way he carried himself left no doubt about his capabilities. He entered the diner with his team, their boots making no sound despite their tactical gear, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. When his gaze fell on Bear McKenna, sitting calmly in his wheelchair with his shirt torn open and that legendary tattoo visible, the operator's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, from professional alertness to something approaching reverence. "Chief McKenna," the team leader said, his voice carrying the respect reserved for legends. "Sir, we received reports of civilians threatening you. Are you injured?" Bear McKenna looked up at the 8 Navy SEALs who had just entered the Frontier Grill, their presence transforming the space from a roadside diner into what felt like a military briefing room. "I'm fine, Commander," Bear replied, though he made no effort to cover the torn shirt or the tattoo that had started this entire confrontation. "Just having breakfast with some new friends." The SEAL commander, whose name tag read STEEL, though that wasn't the name he'd been born with, turned his attention to the Iron Wolves, who had gone from aggressive predators to trapped prey in the space of 30 seconds. "Gentlemen," Steele said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made drill sergeants nervous, "you're in the presence of one of America's most decorated warriors. Chief McKenna has more confirmed kills than my entire unit combined, has served in more classified operations than most people have clearance to even hear about, and has earned decorations that are still sealed by national security classification." He paused, letting that information sink in. "Now, I need you to explain to me why you thought it was appropriate to put your hands on him." Diesel Morrison, who 20 minutes earlier had felt like the king of the world, now stood frozen as 8 of America's most elite soldiers waited for his answer. The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, but no sound emerged. Spider, the scrawny lieutenant, tried to salvage the situation with typical brilliance. "We didn't know he was... he looks like just some old guy in a wheelchair." Steele's expression could have frozen molten steel. "Just some old guy," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "Gentlemen, let me educate you about the old guy you just assaulted." He gestured toward Bear, who was calmly finishing his coffee, as if 8 SEALs and 6 terrified bikers were just part of the breakfast entertainment. "Chief Thomas McKenna, call sign Bear, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, 47 years of active service. 347 confirmed kills across 7 major conflicts and approximately 400 classified operations. Congressional Medal of Honor, 3 Navy Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and decorations from 14 allied nations." The numbers landed like physical blows. Even Helen the waitress had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was staring openly. He's been shot 17 times, stabbed 4 times, blown up by IEDs on 3 separate occasions, and has spent a combined total of 8 months in enemy captivity without breaking. The wheelchair is from his final mission, providing sniper cover for the extraction of a CIA operative in Afghanistan. He took shrapnel from an IED blast but continued fighting until the helicopter was clear. Steele took a step closer to Diesel, close enough that the biker could smell the gunpowder residue on the operator's gear. This man has forgotten more about warfare than you'll ever learn. He's killed enemy combatants with weapons you've never heard of, in countries you can't pronounce, during operations that won't be declassified until your grandchildren are dead. The SEAL commander reached into his tactical vest and produced a satellite phone, the kind that worked anywhere on Earth and connected directly to people who didn't officially exist. Now, I'm going to make a phone call. I'm going to speak to some people who take a very dim view of civilians threatening America's most decorated warriors. And then we're going to discuss what happens to people who make that kind of mistake. He dialed a number from memory, waited exactly 3 seconds, and spoke into the phone. This is Steele. We have a Code 7 situation at the Frontier Grill. Chief McKenna was assaulted by civilians, requesting immediate jurisdictional transfer and administrative review. The voice on the other end was clear enough for everyone to hear. Transfer approved. Local law enforcement has been notified. Detainment authorized pending federal review. Steele hung up and looked at the iron wolves with the expression a scientist might use when studying particularly uninteresting bacteria. Congratulations, gentlemen. You've just committed federal assault on a classified military asset. The FBI will be here in approximately 20 minutes to escort you to a detention facility where you'll remain until people much more important than me decide what to do with you. Diesel Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than the intimidating growl he'd been using earlier. Wait, this is bullshit. We didn't know. You can't just... Can't what? Steele interrupted. Can't protect a decorated veteran from assault? Can't respond when civilians threaten military personnel? Can't ensure that people who've served this country with distinction are treated with appropriate respect? He smiled, and it was the kind of expression that probably appeared in Diesel's nightmares for years afterward. Actually, not only can we do all of that, but we're specifically trained, equipped, and authorized to do exactly that. One of Steele's team members, a compact woman whose gear identified her as an EOD specialist, stepped forward with zip tie. Restraints. Hands behind your backs, please. All of you. The Iron Wolves looked around the diner as if searching for some escape route, some ally, some miracle that would return them to the world of 20 minutes ago when they'd been the biggest threats in the room. But the farmer was nodding approvingly, the truck drivers were grinning, and Helen the waitress was wiping away tears of what looked suspiciously like pride. Bear McKenna, meanwhile, had signaled for more coffee and was studying the menu as if deciding between pancakes and French toast was the most pressing concern in his immediate future. Chief, Steele said, approaching Bear's table with obvious respect, is there anything you need? Medical attention? Transportation? Someone to call? Bear looked up at the young SEAL commander, a man probably 40 years his junior, but operating in the same brotherhood of warriors that Bear had helped establish decades earlier. I'm fine, son, though I appreciate you boys showing up. Been a while since I had this much backup for breakfast. Steele smiled, a real smile this time, not the predatory expression he'd shown the bikers. Sir, it's an honor. Most of us grew up hearing stories about your operations. The Tehran extraction, the Beirut infiltration, the Cambodia thing we're not supposed to talk about. Cambodia? Bear's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. Son, if you've heard stories about Cambodia, you've got a higher clearance level than I thought. As federal agents arrived and the Iron Wolves were escorted to a future that didn't include motorcycle rallies or roadside intimidation, the diner gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The farmer went back to his crop reports, the truck drivers resumed their route argument, and the elderly couple finished their waffle. But something had changed. The other patrons kept glancing at Bear's table, not with curiosity or pity, but with the kind of respect usually reserved for monuments and national holidays. Helen approached with a fresh pot of coffee and a slice of apple pie that Bear hadn't ordered. "On the house," she said quietly, "for everything you've done, for everything you've sacrificed." Bear accepted the pie with a nod of thanks, understanding that this wasn't about free dessert. It was about recognition, respect, and the kind of gratitude that couldn't be expressed in words. "Ma'am," he said, "I was just doing my job. Same as you do yours, same as everyone else does theirs. The only difference is that my job happened to involve more explosions than most." As the federal agents finished their paperwork and the last of the Iron Wolves disappeared into the back of unmarked vehicles, Steele approached Bear's table one final time. "Chief, if you don't mind me asking, what are your plans? Where are you headed?" Bear McKenna looked out the window at the highway stretching toward the horizon, at the endless possibilities that existed beyond the limits of small towns and breakfast diners. "Nowhere special," he said. "Just seeing the country I spent 47 years protecting. Turns out it's worth the trip." Steele nodded, understanding something that couldn't be taught in any military training program, that some journeys were about more than destinations. "If you ever need anything, Chief, anything at all, you have my number, and the number of every other operator in the community. We take care of our own." "I know you do, son. That's what makes us different from them." After the SEALs departed and the diner returned to its normal operation, Bear McKenna sat quietly finishing his pie and watching the world through windows that had seen too much drama for one morning. The torn shirt had been replaced with a clean one from his travel bag, but the tattoo remained, a permanent reminder of who he was and what he'd accomplished. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, approached his table with the fearless curiosity that belonged only to children who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the world. "Mister," the boy said, "are you really a Navy SEAL?" Bear looked down at the child, at the honest curiosity in his eyes, at the innocence that Bear and thousands of others had spent their careers protecting. "I was," Bear said gently, "a long time ago." "Did you really kill 300 people?" The boy's mother rushed over, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Tyler, you can't ask questions like that." But Bear waved her off with a slight smile. "It's okay, ma'am. He's curious." "That's good." He looked back at the boy. "Son, I served in the military for a very long time. Sometimes soldiers have to do difficult things to protect people they care about. I did what I had to do so that kids like you could grow up safe and free." "Like a superhero?" Bear considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would become part of this child's understanding of heroism, duty, and sacrifice. "No, son. Not like a superhero. Superheroes are pretend. I'm just a person who was trained to do a job that needed doing. The real heroes are the people who get up every day and make the world better in small ways. Teachers, doctors, farmers, parents. They're the ones who make it worth protecting." The boy nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. "Thank you for protecting us," he said simply. "Thank you for being worth protecting," Bear replied. As the boy returned to his mother and their own breakfast, Bear McKenna finished his pie and prepared to continue his journey. The highway called with promises of new destinations, new experiences, new opportunities to discover what America had become during the decades he'd spent defending it. He left a $20 tip for Helen, more than twice the cost of his meal, and wheeled toward the door. As he passed other tables, conversations paused, heads nodded respectfully, and more than one person whispered, "Thank you," just loud enough for him to hear. Outside, Bear transferred from his wheelchair to his specially modified motorcycle, a touring bike equipped with hand controls and custom modifications that allowed him to ride despite his disability. The machine was a masterpiece of engineering and determination, proof that limitations were often just problems waiting for creative solutions. As he secured his gear and prepared to ride, a state trooper pulled into the parking lot and approached with obvious purpose. "Sir? I'm Trooper Martinez. I got a call about some disturbance here this morning. Everything okay?" Bear looked up at the young officer, probably someone who'd been in elementary school when Bear was fighting his last war. "Everything's fine, officer. Just some misunderstandings that got cleared up." Martinez nodded, but his expression suggested he'd heard more detailed reports about the morning's events. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying so, it's an honor to meet you. My father served in Iraq. He always said the SEALs were the guys who made the impossible stuff look routine. Your father was a good man then. Takes courage to serve no matter what job you're doing?" "Yes, sir." Martinez paused, then added, "Those bikers who were bothering you? They're looking at federal charges. Assault on a military veteran, disturbing the peace, outstanding warrants in 3 states. They won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Bear nodded, unsurprised. People who made careers out of intimidating others usually had histories that didn't bear close examination. Good. Maybe they'll learn something useful while they're thinking about their life choices. As Bear fired up his motorcycle and prepared to merge onto the highway, he reflected on the morning's events. The Iron Wolves had seen an old man in a wheelchair and assumed weakness. The SEALs had seen the tattoo and understood its significance. The difference wasn't just in military training. It was in understanding that strength came in many forms and that judging people by appearances was usually a mistake. The road stretched ahead, full of possibilities and destinations unknown. Bear McKenna had spent 4 decades defending America's freedom. Now he was finally taking the time to experience what he'd been protecting: the small towns, the good people, the simple pleasures of a country worth fighting for. Behind him, the Frontier Grill returned to its normal routine, but the story of the morning would be told and retold for years to come. It would become legend, passed down through the community as a reminder that heroes don't always look like what people expect, and that respect must be earned but should never be denied to those who've truly earned it. And somewhere on Highway 287, a decorated warrior rode toward his next destination, carrying with him the knowledge that he'd served his country well, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that America was still full of people worth protecting, even if some of them needed occasional reminders about showing proper respect to those who'd done the protecting. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the desert chill, as Bear McKenna disappeared into the distance. Just another traveler on the American highway, carrying stories that would never be fully told and honors that would never be fully understood by those who'd never faced the darkness he'd conquered in service to the light. Some legends, after all, were meant to be lived rather than just remembered.